Hey folks, we're going to talk about Chapter 3.1, a logical view of data. So this is, Chapter 3 is where we start taking a deep dive into specific relational database models and looking at all of the components of that, and then we're going to get into the Oracle data modeler and start actually building out some of our own models using a tool instead of drawing everything by hand. And honestly, the tool's a lot nicer because, my chicken scratch is not great. So I think you'll like when we switch over to the tool. So a couple things about this logical view of data. We've been referring to these entities or tables. Really, like table is the easiest way for us to refer to how we're storing the data here. Right? And there's a couple characteristics of a relational table in a relational database management system here. So again, one of the characteristics is that they're viewed as this two-dimensional structure. It's the idea that we have columns and we have rows. Now, each row or tuple, right, that's our technical term for it here, our tuple, is really like an instance or an occurrence of whatever this entity is. This is our entity or our table, right? And again, these are usually nouns. So whatever this is representing here, a tuple is an instance or a single occurrence of that we're storing. Right? Each column here then represents an attribute. So this is, a single value about that entity. So if we had a table like student, right, again, one attribute might be your name. And again, when we break these out, when we store them, we're probably actually going to be very specific and have like a first name column and a last name column, just to make things easier. Like if you wanted to sort by last name, it's really hard to do if they're all stored in a single field or single column here. So our columns represent an attribute, and we have a distinct name. So each one needs a name of the column as well. Any specific intersection of a row and column is one data item or one data value. For our columns here, they all have a specific format, right? Whether or not it's just a bunch of text or it's a numeric value or whatever we're storing in here. There's lots of different options for types of data that we can store. Commonly we'll deal with text, we'll deal with numeric values, and we'll deal with dates and times. Right? There's a bunch of other ones as well, but those are some really common ones. If your column has a specific range of values, we'll call that the attribute domain. So the domain is saying what are the valid values for this. So in a student table, right, you might have a specific domain for maybe a GPA column. GPA, right? It can't be less than 0 and it can't be more than 4, right? So the domain here is 0 to 4. Another characteristic of our table is the order of the rows and columns really doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter if we say, hey, this column is name and this column is phone number and this column over here is email address. That doesn't matter to the database management system. It's there. When we get to where the physical model and how we store them, yes, it matters. But at this logical view of the data, it doesn't matter. The table is going to do what it's going to do. It's no big deal here. And then the last piece, and this one is actually really, really important. The 8th characteristic of a relational table is that each table that we define needs to have a single attribute or combination of attributes that is a unique identifier. So you need to be able to uniquely identify a given row or a given tuple, a given instance or occurrence based on one or more attributes. Okay, and when it has a specific name, we're going to talk about it just a little bit here, but you need to be able to uniquely identify them. So you can't have two of that same unique identifier in there. So I'm very partial to having a generated ID. I think that's a great way to go. It's nice and easy. It can cause problems down the road, and we'll look at other ways we can deal with some of these, making sure we have no duplicates here. But generally, if the database comes up with a unique identifier for you, it works out really nice. And then we could say, hey, other things might need to be unique. Like we probably shouldn't have two people in here with the same student ID. Right? All of our student IDs are like 7 digits or something like that. We probably shouldn't have duplicate student IDs. And maybe that's our unique identifier. Sure, that's fine. But probably the system generates that for us, and we just use that as your identifier. So we got lots of rules there, and that might have a given domain, right? If it's going to be 7 digits, we'll say, hey, it's at least 1 million here, but it's no more than 999 or 9,990,999. So that might be the domain of the student ID. So those are our characteristics of our relational table. Right, and then the book goes through looking at and again, they have their own student example, which is fine. Their naming convention is really weird. Putting like STU in front of everything for student. You know it's in the student table, so you don't need to put STU for, say, student. So I don't know. I think that's a little silly for their names here. And it goes through it and looks at, hey, it fits each one of these descriptions here. So you can look at that when you're going through the textbook, which you guys are reading the book, right? It's, don't just rely on the things I'm saying here. Make sure that you're spending the time actually going through the text as well. I'm trying to pull out some highlights for you here, pull out the important stuff. But please spend the time reading, right? That's part of that 15 hours a week you're putting into this course, is actually reading the textbook here. So that unique identifier here, this whatever we're going to call it here, is typically known as the primary key. Primary key. And again, it's one or more attributes. So what you don't want to do is pick something that's not going to be unique. Like, because you can have one or more attributes, don't say, hey, first name and last name is going to be unique. There is only one Eric Chernesky in the world that I know of. Sure, that works for me, but if your name is John Smith, the odds are that there's going to be another John Smith somewhere. And, that's just a common name. So use something that will be unique. And, obviously name is not unique. Right, so those are some of the ways of looking at a table, some of the things that make it specifically a relational table with those characteristics. And then we're going to move into the next sections.